There is a psalm in the Bible where three different voices speak within it. The first is a believer making a confession of faith in the first person. The second is someone addressing that believer, declaring promises in the second person. And the third is God taking up the word in the divine first person to close the psalm. All of that in 16 verses. And here is the detail. Most people who read this psalm their whole lives never notice it. They read with their mind somewhere else, feel the comfort of the promises, close the book, and they miss the entire structure of the text. The psalm is Psalm 91, and today we are going to open the three voices of this text, one by one. Why does that matter? Because when you know who is speaking, you understand what is being said. And Psalm 91, read as if it were only one voice, becomes a motivational calendar quote. Read as what it actually is. Three voices in conversation, it becomes something else. It becomes liturgical drama. It becomes mutual testimony. It becomes divine oracle. Before we open the text, we need to talk about the weight of this psalm, because you need to understand something. This is not just any psalm in the Bible. It is one of the most used, most quoted, most memorized, and most historically loaded texts in all of Scripture. In ancient Jewish tradition, Psalm 91 has a nickname. It is called Shir Shel Pegaim. In Hebrew, pega means a strike, a blow, a violent contact that comes from outside and knocks you down. Pegaim, in the plural, are the things that strike you before you see them coming. A literal translation of the title would be Song of the Strikings. An interpretive translation would be Song Against Demons. Why that name? Because from at least the first centuries of the Christian era, and probably much earlier, Psalm 91 was recited in Judaism as protection against hostile spiritual beings. This is not a modern imported reading. It is recorded in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Sheviot, page 15. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi had the custom of reciting this psalm together with Psalm 3 before going to sleep. And the text itself calls this practice Shir Shel Pegaim, a song against the strikings. And it gets even older than that. In the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, there is a document known as 11Q11. It is a small scroll, dated by paleography specialists between the years 50 and 68 of the Christian era. This scroll contains 4 compositions. The first 3 are exorcism formulas. The fourth is Psalm 91, the whole psalm, copied as the final piece of a manual for spiritual combat. In other words, around the same time, Peter and Paul were writing letters to the churches of the Mediterranean. A Jewish community in the Judean wilderness was already reading Psalm 91 as a text of exorcism, not as the lyrics of an edifying hymn, as a weapon. And the tradition continues in the following centuries. Between the 3rd and 9th centuries of the Christian era, both Jews and Christians began inscribing verses from Psalm 91 on small pieces of parchment and metal, folding them and wearing them as amulets. Archaeologists have discovered in Mesopotamia more than 2,000 ceramic bowls buried upside down beneath the thresholds of houses. The bowls had verses written in Aramaic in a spiral on the inside, and Psalm 91 appears in a significant portion of them. The idea was to trap the demon under the inverted bowl, with the psalm as a seal. That same reflex appears again in cultures very different from one another, connected by one pattern. At the hour of invisible danger, the ancient human being ran to Psalm 91. So when you open the Bible to this psalm, you are not opening just any text. You are opening the text most often used as spiritual protection in 3,000 years of Jewish and Christian history. That is the weight. And there is still one detail in the New Testament that changes everything. This is the only psalm the devil quotes from memory, in person, in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 4 and in Luke chapter 4, during the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, Satan takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple. And to convince Jesus to throw himself down from there, he quotes Psalm 91, verses 11 and 12. He will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Notice who is quoting. It is not a disciple, it is not a prophet, it is not Jesus, it is Satan. The only moment in the entire New Testament where the devil opens the Hebrew Bible and quotes a psalm by heart is with Psalm 91. And he had a specific reason for choosing this psalm and not another. We will return to that in the final section because the answer involves a hidden detail in the quotation that completely changes the meaning. For now, hold on to the image. The psalm most used against demons in 1,000 years of Jewish history is the same psalm the devil himself quoted to the face of Jesus. Let us open the text, and this is where things become truly interesting. The psalm begins this way. Verse 1. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Verse 2. I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Look at what happens. In verse 1, someone is describing. There is an anonymous subject, he who dwells. There is no I, no you. It is description in the third person, like a narrator presenting a scene. In verse 2, the camera changes. Suddenly, an I appears. I will say to the Lord. Who is this I? He appeared out of nowhere. The previous verse had no I, and now an I speaks, and what he speaks is a personal confession of faith. My refuge, not a refuge, my. The first voice has already entered, and we had not even noticed. In Hebrew, this transition is even more abrupt, because the original text has no quotation marks, no punctuation. Modern translators added punctuation to soften the movement, but in the Hebrew manuscript you read, Yoshev Beseta Elyon, the one who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. And in the next line, it is already Omar La'ah, I will say to the Lord. From third person to first person, without warning, without punctuation, without mediation. It is worth unpacking that first line, because it carries a weight that gets flattened in English. Yoshev Beseta Elyon. Yoshev comes from the root yashav, which means to sit, to reside, to dwell. But pay attention, it is a participle, not a simple action verb. Yoshev is not someone who visited the shelter once, nor someone who shows up every now and then. It is someone who lives there, resides there, has a fixed address in the shelter of the Most High. The English translation, he who dwells, captures it, but the texture of the Hebrew is stronger. It is residence, not visitation. And sita, shelter, or secret place, is a technical word. It appears in Psalm 27:5, describing the shelter of the tabernacle, the most protected place of the sanctuary. It is the kind of hiding place that only exists because someone is hiding you. It is not hiding behind a tree. It is being hidden by another, in a refuge another has built. And here the first strange thing in the psalm appears. Look at how many names of God appear in the first two verses. Elyon in verse 1, first half. Shaddai, verse 1, second half. YHWH, verse 2. Elohim, also in verse 2. 4 names of God compressed into 2 verses. That is rare in the book of Psalms. Extremely rare. There are 150 psalms in the Psalter, and the concentration of 4 divine names in 2 lines is not something you find often. To give you an idea, the name Shaddai, Almighty, appears exactly twice in the entire book of Psalms. Twice. One is in Psalm 68, and the other is here in Psalm 91:1. The author took one of the rarest names of God in the whole Psalter and placed it in the first sentence of the psalm. Why? The answer has to do with the content of what comes next. Each name carries a different texture, and the author wants the hearer to feel the totality of God before the promises even begin. Elyon, the Most High, is the God who is above. It comes from the ancient Hebrew world of the Western Semitic peoples. It is the title used for the highest God. In the psalm, it is cosmic position, above everything, above everyone. Shaddai, the Almighty, is the patriarchal name. This is how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew God before YHWH was revealed to Moses. It carries the density of tradition. It is the God of the beginning, the God of the family promises. YHWH, in verse 2, is the covenant name. It is the name God revealed to Moses at Sinai. It carries covenant. It carries the specific way Israel relates to God. And Elohim, closing the sequence, is the more general name, a plural of majesty. The Creator God, the God of all peoples, the God of everything that exists. In 2 lines, the psalmist compresses the cosmic God, the God of the patriarchs, the God of the covenant, the God of creation. It is as if he had said, everything God is the refuge of this person who dwells in the shelter. And that is the first voice. It begins in anonymous description and ends in personal confession loaded with tradition. Someone who dwells in the refuge and who opens his mouth to declare who the God of that refuge is, gathering 4 names in 2 lines. This is not mechanical Bible reading. This is a person who knows very well whom he is invoking. Now comes the strange part, because from verse 3 on, the voice changes again. The one who was saying, "I will say to the Lord," disappears, and another voice appears, speaking to someone else. Look at verse 3. "For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. You," verse 5, "you will not fear the terror of the night. You will not fear." Verse 7, 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. You. From first person to second person, again without warning. The one who was saying "my" no longer speaks, and someone enters, addressing another. Who is this someone, and who is he speaking to? To answer those 2 questions, you need to understand something about the possible use of this psalm in the Temple of Jerusalem. There is a reading that has gained strength among modern commentators on the psalm. Psalm 91 was not written to be read silently by one person alone. It was written to be performed, enacted inside the sanctuary, recited aloud with more than one participant, possibly as a ritual of admitting the pilgrim into the sacred presence. Imagine the scene. A pilgrim goes up to Jerusalem. He passes through the gates of the city, climbs the Temple Mount, arrives at the entrance of the sanctuary, and there, at the threshold, a priest is waiting. The pilgrim says in the first person, "I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." He makes a public confession of who the God is that he has come to worship. And the priest, in response, declares over him, in the second person, all the promises of protection from verse 3 onward. He will deliver you. You will not fear. 1,000 may fall at your side. Liturgical dialogue with defined voices in defined places in sacred space. Another possibility is that the psalmist, alone in the composition, writes the 2 voices to dramatize internally what happens within every believer. You dwell in the shelter, you confess in the first person, and then you hear in the second person the oracle that covers you. However one interprets it, the structure is the same. 2 voices are already established, and the third is still missing, the most radical one of all. The second voice enters as the counterweight to the first. The first was the confession of the one who dwells in the refuge. The second is the response, another person speaking to that first person, applying the promise in the second person. And who is this other person? The text does not identify him. It may be the priest in the temple, as I have mentioned. It may be an older brother in the faith, more experienced, who hears the confession and responds with the oracle. It may be an inner voice of the believer himself, hearing the promises come from a deeper place in the conscience. It may be an angel. It may be a prophet. The psalm leaves it open, and that openness is intentional. The function matters more than the identity. The function is this: someone testifies from the outside in to what the believer confessed from the inside out. And look at what this voice will do in the next verses. It will take the promises of protection and stack them one on top of another in a rising cadence. Verse after verse, threat after threat, refuge after refuge. It is as if the priest opened a vast inventory of everything that can strike a human being, and then crossed threat after threat off the list with the same formula. This will not touch you. Let us begin with verse 3. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. Two images, hunter, disease. Notice how carefully the author chooses the pairs of threat. One comes from outside, in your direction. The other comes from within, without your seeing it. The hunter is visible. Pestilence is invisible. The hunter is intentional. Pestilence is silent. Together the two cover the whole field of human threat. What attacks you on purpose and what strikes you as if by accident. Snare in Hebrew is pach. Fowler is yakush, from the root yakash, which means to lay a trap, to set a snare. And this is not the great hunter of elephants and lions. It is the bird catcher, the one who sets the small trap, waits for the creature to land, and catches it. The image matters because it suggests that the threat can arrive disguised, hidden, subtle. It is not the predator roaring. It is the invisible cord in the grass. And deadly pestilence in Hebrew is deva havat. Deva really is pestilence, epidemic. Havat, translated as deadly or destructive, comes from a root with the sense of calamity, ruin. Translations vary, and each translator chooses a shade. Deadly pestilence, destructive plague, pernicious disease. In every case, it is disease that kills. Verse 4, he will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. 4 images in a single line: pinions, wings, shield, buckler. 2 of these images come from a bird, 2 come from a soldier, and that mixture is intentional. Pinions is Ivra, wings is Kanaf. The picture is a hen protecting her chicks under her own wings, or an eagle spreading its span over its young. In fact, Jesus uses exactly this image in Matthew 23:37 when he weeps over Jerusalem. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. The language comes straight from Psalm 91:4. Jesus is citing it without saying that he is citing it. And then the military images enter. Shield is Tzina, buckler is Sohera. Here there is an interesting technical detail. Tzina is the large rectangular shield that covered the soldier from head to foot. Sohera is the smaller round shield used in close combat. The psalmist joins the two in a single line: total protection. Cover at a distance and cover in close encounter. Bird covering and battle covering in the same sentence. And the complement to this image is, his faithfulness is a shield and buckler. In Hebrew, faithfulness here is emet, a word that carries the sense of firm faithfulness, covenant loyalty. It is not merely the opposite of falsehood, it is the reliability of the one who keeps what he promised. The shield of the psalm is not a philosophical abstraction, it is God's faithfulness to his pledged word. It is the covenant functioning as armor. Now the next 2 verses, and here things become fascinating. Verses 5 and 6. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. 4 threats. and ancient Jewish commentators looked at this list and noticed a structure. The threats are organized in pairs of time: night, day, darkness, noonday. Each pair covers a specific moment in the 24-hour cycle, as if no hour were left outside. But here the psalm has a layer that escapes in English translation. The same ancient Jewish commentators read these four threats not only as general categories of fear, they read them as proper names. Each one would be a spiritual entity with personality. Terror of the night in Hebrew is pachad laila. Pachad is sudden dread, that shock that tightens the chest without warning. And in ancient rabbinic tradition, this pachad was associated with a demonic figure called Lilith, an entity that, according to the folklore that developed at the margins of Second Temple Judaism, attacked people during sleep. The Talmud records that this verse of Psalm 91, read aloud before sleeping, was specific protection against Lilith. The arrow that flies by day in Hebrew is Chetz Ya'uf Yomam, and this image, in some ancient traditions, was read as an entity called simply the arrow, something that crosses the air and strikes without warning. Not the physical arrow of an enemy archer, but a spiritual arrow, flying unseen. The pestilence that stalks in darkness is Deva Baufel. Here the parallelism is interesting. The pestilence from verse 3 returns, but now with a specific address: the darkness. The disease that acts at night, in the darkness of the body, in the darkness of the room. And the fourth threat, the destruction that wastes at noonday. In Hebrew, it is Keteb Yashud Sohorayim. Keteb is a rare word in the Old Testament. It has the sense of destruction, ruin. And in this ancient reading tradition, Keteb was the name of a specific demon, the demon of noonday, the entity that attacked at the hour of strongest heat, when the sun stood overhead and the shadow disappeared beneath the feet. The first Christian monks in the Egyptian desert, in the 4th century of the Christian era, had an expression for this. They called it the noonday demon. The patristic tradition read verse 6 of Psalm 91 and identified here the specific temptation that attacks the monk in the middle of the afternoon, when the heat grows heavy, prayer weakens, and the soul wavers. Acedia, the spiritual despondency of the hottest hour, and they anchored that reading here in the Keteb of noonday. I'm not going to say that the psalm, in its origin, intended to refer to 4 demons with names and surnames. The text is more open than that, but I will say one thing. This reading has 2,000 years of tradition behind it, and it explains why the psalm became an amulet, became an exorcism, became a song against the strikings. When the believer recited, "You will not fear the terror of the night," he was not reading an abstract category of fear. He was naming a specific force and confronting it with the word. Verse 7, 1,000 may fall at your side, 10,000 at your right hand, but it will not come near you. Here the author raises the stakes. This is not small protection. This is protection in a catastrophic scene. Where 1,000 people fall, where 10,000 people fall, you remain standing. And notice the geographical precision: at your side, at your right hand. The psalm does not say far away. It says right beside you. People fall next to you and you remain. And verse 8 completes it. You will only look with your eyes and see the recompense of the wicked. You will see. You will not escape seeing. You will witness, and even while witnessing, you will not be touched. Some read this verse as satisfaction at seeing the enemy fall. The reading more faithful to the text, in my view, is a contrast of destinies. You will see the judgment of those who rejected the refuge, and that sight will confirm where you chose to dwell. It is not pleasure in another person's fall. It is sober awareness of the contrast. Verse 9, because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge. And look at what happens. For the first time in the middle of the second voices block, an I appears again. The Most High, who is my refuge. Who speaks? Is it the believer from the first voice returning? Is it the priest, now identified also as a believer? Translators have debated this line for centuries. Some versions translate, "Because you have made the Lord your refuge," smoothing out the break. Other versions preserve the "my" of the literal Hebrew and accept the discomfort of the shift. The literal reading of the Hebrew has its own beauty. It is as if, in the middle of the promises, the priest interrupted himself, remembered that he too is a believer. Let out, almost as a sigh, "The Most High, my refuge," and then return to the promise. Confession inside oracle. The messenger's voice leaking personal faith in the middle of the delivery, and then the promise returns. "No evil shall be allowed to befall you, no plague come near your tent." Dwelling place here is Maon. Tent is Ohel. The two words evoke the nomad who pitches and takes down his dwelling as he walks. But if God is the Maon, the dwelling is fixed in the middle of movement. You may be crossing the wilderness, setting up a tent on new ground every week, and the true dwelling does not change, because the tent is temporary. But the Most High is the permanent dwelling that covers all temporary tents. And here is where things become explosive. Verses 11 and 12. "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone." Notice the detail. Angels in the plural. This is not one individual bodyguard angel. It is a contingent, a troop. God gives a command, and the language is military. Tzava in Hebrew is the verb for commanding an armed unit, ordering with the authority of a commander. And the object of this command is protection, to guard, to bear up, to prevent stumbling. And look at the precision. They will bear you up in all your ways. Not only in the dangerous ways, all of them, lest you strike your foot against a stone. The detail is so fine that it covers even the smallest stumble. A paving stone, the kind of thing that catches a sandal badly. The protection comes down to the level of the small detail, the daily insignificance, the little stone that makes someone twist an ankle. And these are exactly the verses Satan quoted to Jesus in the temptation in the wilderness. And when we reach the final section, I will show you the little word, or rather the little phrase, the devil left out when he recited this text. One omission. But it completely changes the meaning of the promise, and it explains why Jesus answered the way he did. For now, hold on to the thread. Angels in the plural, command of protection, care for the small detail, and a crucial omission in the satanic quotation that we will unpack shortly. Verse 13, "You will tread on the lion and the adder, the young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot." 4 animals, and here the psalm makes a leap. It moves from protection against natural threats to protection against symbolically charged threats. Lion in Hebrew is shachal. Young lion is kefir. Adder is pithan, a kind of venomous snake, possibly the Egyptian cobra that appears so often in pharaonic iconography. Serpent is tannin, a word that in the Old Testament describes both sea monsters and great serpents. Tannin is the same word that appears in Genesis 1:21, describing the great sea creatures God created. This is not just any animal, it is a creature from the beginning of the world. Ancient Jewish commentators looked at this list and read each animal as a representation of hostile force. Not literal animals that appear on the path, forces. The lion is the force that roars and terrifies you by its presence. The adder is the force that bites before you see it coming. The young lion is the young, agile, aggressive force, even more dangerous than the old lion because it reacts quickly. The serpent is the ancestral, cosmic, primordial force that comes from the chaos before chaos. And the verbs the psalmist uses to describe what the believer does with these animals are strong. Darak, to tread, and ramas, to trample underfoot. This is the language of ancient military victory. The victorious king placed his foot on the neck of the defeated king as a public sign of dominion. The warrior stepped on the body of the enemy in front of the troops. The psalmist places the believer who dwells in the refuge in that position, not running from the hostile forces, not dodging them, stepping on them. And to close the block of the second voice, it is important to notice something about the entire structure of verses 3 to 13. Hebrew psalmists organize texts with meticulous care, and this block has 11 verses, 11, a strange number for Hebrew poetic organization, which often moves in pairs or in multiples of 7. Why 11? The most common reading is that the second voice extends from verse 3 to verse 13, and from there, in verse 14, the third voice, the divine voice, enters. But some ancient readers suggested another division, that the second voice goes only to verse 8, and that from verse 9 to 13 there is already another intermediate voice, or a partial return of the first voice. This alternative division tries to solve the problem of my refuge in verse 9, which sounds like personal confession and not direct promise. I will not impose a division. I will be honest about what the text does. The psalm leaves this ambiguity in the original Hebrew, and that ambiguity is not a flaw in the composition. It is a feature. The psalm wants the voice of promise and the voice of confession to overlap, to show something important. The one who speaks promise is also someone who confesses, and the one who confesses also bears witness to another. The voices are not impermeable. They flow into one another. But now the third voice arrives. And this is the most radical of all, because this voice is not human. The first voice was the believer who dwells in the shelter. The second voice was the priest, or the witness, or the spiritual guide who applied the promises. Both were human voices, though charged with inspiration. Now, in verse 14, something changes in the text, and almost no one notices it on the first reading. I will read the verse, and then we will take apart what happened. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. I will protect him, because he knows my name. Take this verse, read it again carefully, because he holds fast to me in love. Who is speaking? It is no longer the priest. It is no longer the believer. It is God. And you notice something. Until verse 13, the promise came in the second person. He will deliver you. You will not fear. The angels will bear you up. Everything was directed to the believer with a direct pronoun. Now in verse 14, the pronoun changes. It is no longer you, it is he. I will deliver him. He knows my name. I will answer him. Will answer. I will be with him in trouble. And the you of the believer, which had been there the whole time, disappears. The believer becomes third person. He becomes the subject being spoken about. And the brilliant question is, whom is God speaking to? Because if the believer has become he, then someone is listening to this speech. Someone to whom God points to the believer and says, concerning this one, I will do this. Some ancient readings suggest that God is speaking to the angels of verse 11, the same angels who received the military command to protect. Now they receive the explanation. Look at this one who has held fast to me. This one you will deliver. This one you will bear up. This one I will glorify. Other readings suggest that God is speaking to the whole heavenly court. That scene that appears in Job 1:6, when the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, as if the believer were presented in that court, and the Father, in the presence of the heavenly beings, declared his destiny. Still, other readings suggest that God is not speaking to anyone in particular, that the change of pronoun is simply a rhetorical device to create distance, to show the sovereignty of the divine voice, which does not need to look directly at anyone in order to speak with weight. Personally, I find the heavenly court reading the most beautiful, And this is my observation based on the structure of the text. Why? Because it explains why the psalm ended this way. If God is presenting the believer before a heavenly assembly, then everything that came before prepares this moment. The threats, the protections, the angels, the animals. The believer was surrounded, protected, sustained, placed on his feet over the lion and the serpent. And now he is presented, shown, guaranteed by the word of the Most High in front of the hosts of heaven. But let us look at what this third voice declares. Verse 14. Because he holds fast to me in love, I will deliver him. The Hebrew word translated here as holds fast to me in love is shashak. And this word deserves attention. Shashak is not the common Hebrew verb for love. The common verb is ahav. Ahav is broad love. It covers affection between friends. It covers affection between husband and wife. It covers affection between God and his people. Shashak is something else. Shashak is rarer, more specific. It appears only a few times in the Old Testament, and it means passionate attachment, a bond so strong that the soul adheres. A love that is not merely feeling, it is clinging. To give you an idea, the verb chashak appears in Deuteronomy 7:7 when the text explains why God chose Israel. The common translation says that the Lord set his love on them. But the Hebrew there is shashak, attachment, bonding, the love that chooses and in choosing clings. The verb also appears in the context of a man who attaches himself to a woman in Genesis 34:8. It is love that binds with force, and the psalm places this verb in a completed Hebrew form. This is not love that began yesterday. It is established love. The believer has already clung to God, and God declares in response to that clinging, I will deliver him. The cause of deliverance is not the believer's merit. It is not perfect obedience. It is attachment. It is adhesion. It is chashak. In fact, some read this verse as reciprocity. The believer clung to God, and the God who sees that attachment responds with his own chashak. The attachment is mutual. God clung first, gave the covenant, gave the promise. The believer responded with attachment, and now God, in the third voice, confirms that the cycle has closed. And the other half of the verse is equally interesting. Because he knows my name. To know here is yada, and yada is not information. It is not, I know what you are called. It is knowledge of intimacy. The same verb appears in Genesis 4:1 when the text says that Adam knew Eve, knowing in the sense of absolute intimacy. And the object of this knowing is my name, in Hebrew Shemi. Name in Hebrew is not a label. It is not what you answer when someone asks. Name is the essence of being. It is revealed identity. When God says, he knows my name, he is not saying he knows the syllable that identifies me. He is saying he knows who I am. He knows the essence. He knows the covenant. He knows the faithfulness. He knows the character. And here there is an important connection with verse 2 at the beginning of the psalm, when the first voice said, I will say to the Lord. To say the name of the Lord is to confess who he is. And now, in verse 14, God confirms it. This one, the one who confessed my name, truly knows my name. It was not confession of the mouth only. It was knowledge of intimacy. And that is why God declares, I will set him securely on high. In Hebrew, the high place is misgav. The same root appears in other passages of the Psalms when God is called a height, an inaccessible fortress. To set someone in the misgav is to lift him to a place where nothing that crawls, nothing that comes from below, nothing that prowls in the dust can reach. Verse 15, when he calls to me, I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will rescue him and honor him. 4 promises in one line: calling, answer, companionship in trouble, honor. And notice something important here. God does not say, I will remove trouble from his life. He says, I will be with him in trouble. In Hebrew, I am is the preposition that indicates presence together. I, with him, inside it. The psalm does not promise a life without pressure. It promises companionship inside the pressure. And only after the companionship comes the rescue. The order matters. First, presence, then deliverance. It is not deliverance that makes presence unnecessary. It is presence that leads to deliverance. And there is another interesting word in the verse, honor. In Hebrew it is kavod, from which comes kavod, the word glory. Kavod means to be heavy, to give weight, to give density. When God honors or glorifies, he gives weight. He gives importance. He gives density of presence to what was light, to what had no weight. The believer who clung, who knew the name, who called, who was answered in trouble, now receives weight. He becomes a person of weight in the economy of the kingdom, not heavy in a fleshly sense, weighty in the sense that his life has spiritual density, and that density is a gift from God, not an achievement of the believer. And verse 16 closes the psalm, with long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. Two final promises. Long life in Hebrew orek yamim, length of days, not simply long life in quantity, full life in quality, satisfaction of days, reaching the end without the bitter taste of having lived halfway. And the word satisfy in Hebrew saba is the same word used to describe hunger being filled, desire fulfilled, the cup full. God says, I will fill this one with days until he is satisfied, and in satisfying him, I will show him my salvation. Show is ra in Hebrew, the verb of seeing with the eyes. This is not intellectual information, it is vision, it is experience. The believer will see with his own eyes what God is doing. And here, many ancient Jewish commentators read this final vision as a vision of the world to come, as an anticipation of the Messianic age. And that is why this psalm became so important in Jewish liturgies of mourning, because it promises not only protection in life, but continuity that surpasses life. And now we need to return to the thread we left hanging, back in verses 11 and 12. Psalm 91 appears in a famous scene in the New Testament. Matthew 4:6. Luke 4:10-11, Jesus is in the wilderness 40 days, without food, maximum physical weakness, and Satan appears. He brings 3 temptations. The second of these temptations in Matthew's order takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple, and Satan proposes, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. That "it is written" is a direct quotation of Psalm 91:11-12. Satan is using the text we have just studied. He quotes the book. He quotes exactly the book that promises angelic protection, and he proposes a jump. Jump. If the promise is true, the angels will catch you. Prove it. And here is the omission. I will compare them side by side so it becomes clear. Psalm 91:11-12 in the original. For he will command his angels concerning you, to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Satan's quotation in Matthew 4:6. He will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Did you find the difference? Satan cut a phrase. He cut to guard you in all your ways, the phrase that says how the protection works. And that phrase is the axis of the verse. In all your ways in Hebrew is bekol derakecha, ways in the plural. Derek is the concrete way, the road, the route. But it is also the metaphorical way, the manner of life, the conduct that follows the commandments. And the phrase, in all your ways, qualifies the promise. The angels guard the believer in the ways God has traced, in the ways of faithfulness, in the ways of obedience. The promise is not generic, it is contextual. It operates within the path of the one who walks with God. It does not operate as a safety net for someone who decides to jump from a pinnacle to impress an audience. And that is exactly what Satan does when he quotes the text. He removes the context. He turns the promise into an amulet. He turns protection into permission. As if you could use the psalm to justify any reckless adventure. You jumped, you are protected. There is a verse that guarantees it. And Jesus responds with another quotation, Matthew 4:7. Again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. The quotation is from Deuteronomy 6:16. And in this response, Jesus dismantles the whole strategy. First, he affirms that the sacred text is real. He does not deny Psalm 91. He does not say the promise is false. Second, he affirms that the sacred text has context. It cannot be used against itself. The protection of the psalm is not a license to force God's hand. Third, he affirms that clinging to God, which is the theme of verse 14 of the psalm, is the opposite of testing God. The one who loves with shashak does not jump to see whether he will be caught. The one who loves with shashak trusts that God's way is the way that protects. The earliest Christian commentators looked at this scene and noticed the beauty of the construction. Jesus in the wilderness shows how to read Psalm 91 correctly. He shows that the promise of protection presupposes the way of the covenant, and that removing either end, the way or the protection, distorts the text. Some read this whole scene as the public rehabilitation of the right way to interpret Scripture. Satan is the first to use the Bible badly in the gospel narratives. Jesus is the one who teaches by his own answer how to use the Bible well. And here is where the reading of the three voices we have made gains even more meaning. Because the first voice, the believer's voice, confesses that he dwells in the refuge. The second voice, the priest's voice, declares that the angels guard the believer in his ways. The third voice, God's voice, guarantees that the one who clings will be delivered. The three voices only work together. Remove one and you distort the others. Satan removed the phrase from the middle. He removed the way. He kept only the protection. And in that amputation he turned a covenant song into a proposal for spectacle. And Jesus, by refusing, does not reject the psalm. He rejects the amputated reading of the psalm. And there is still one more thing to observe in this scene before we move forward. The earliest church fathers, reading this temptation, noticed that Jesus is on the pinnacle of the temple, the highest place of the sacred building. And Psalm 91 says that the believer is set in the Misgav, the high stronghold. Some patristic commentators read this geographical coincidence as deep irony. Satan takes Jesus up high and proposes a fall. God, in the psalm, sets the believer on high and promises sustaining. Both heights exist. One is the height of temptation, which invites the jump. The other is the height of covenant, which sustains the one who clings. Jesus, by refusing the fall, chooses the right height. And this choice, the choice of the right height, closes a symmetry that many people miss in Psalm 91. Back in verse 1, the believer was presented as the one who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. In Hebrew, shelter is sita, hidden place, covered place. The believer entered through the door of humility, through the confession that he needed shelter. Now, in verse 16, God satisfies him with long life and shows him salvation. And between those two ends, the believer was lifted to the Misgav, the high stronghold. He went from the Sita to the Misgav. He went from the hidden shelter and was placed in the inaccessible height. The one who entered low ended lifted up. And this is not his merit. It is the consequence of the attachment the psalm described in the divine voice. And there is something interesting about how the psalm has been used over time. In ancient Judaism, it appears in a collection of songs called Shir Shel Pegaim, the song against harms. And it is part of the prayer that many traditional Jews still recite before lying down, called Kriyat Shema al-Hamita, the recitation of the Shema over the bed. Why? Because verses 5 and 6 speak exactly about what happens at night. You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness. Night was the time of fear, the time when sight fails, the time when a sound becomes a monster, and the one going to sleep wanted to know whether the shelter remained standing while the eyes closed. Psalm 91 answered yes, and that is why it became a bedside song. From ancient Israel to traditional Jewish communities today, the reading is a gift for the one who needs companionship in the darkness. And ancient rabbinic tradition has another interesting intuition about who may have written this psalm. Psalm 90, the previous psalm, is the only psalm in the Psalter that carries the inscription, "A prayer of Moses, the man of God." And several ancient Jewish commentators suggested that Psalm 91 was a continuation of Psalm 90, written by the same hand. The natural question is, why Moses? Here a beautiful connection appears. Moses is the figure who, in Exodus 33:22, asks to see the glory of God, and God answers by placing him in a cleft of the rock. In Hebrew, cleft of the rock is Nikrat Hatzur, and God says, "I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by." The image is exactly the image of the shelter in the psalm, a body placed in the cleft, a divine hand covering. Psalm 91 begins with the same figure, the one who dwells in the shelter of the Most High. The ancient rabbis perceived that rhyme, and they suggested that Moses, who lived the experience of the cleft, was the one who sang the psalm of the cleft. We have no way to prove that authorship. Psalm 91 has no superscription, but the theological intuition is good. The one who lived the shelter is the one who teaches the shelter. And this connection with Moses helps us understand better the function of the three voices we have studied. The first voice, the believer's voice, is the voice of one who has taken refuge. The personal voice, the voice of confession. The second voice, the priest or spiritual guide, is the voice of one who has seen the shelter work in other lives and now applies the promise to the one who needs to hear it. The third voice, God's voice, is the voice that confirms the shelter is real, that it is not beautiful poetry, that it is covenant. The three voices form what we might call the chain of faith. One person confesses, another teaches, God confirms. Remove one of the three and the chain breaks. Without personal confession, the promise becomes cold theory. Without the voice that teaches, confession hangs loose in the air. Without divine confirmation, everything becomes human feeling. All three need to be in the text, and that is why the psalm, though short, has so much force, because it places all three in the same song. And the early church fathers read this psalm with a similar sensitivity. For several patristic commentators, Psalm 91 described three overlapping realities. First, it described the ordinary believer who trusts in God and is protected. Second, it described Christ, who trod upon the lion and the serpent according to verse 13. Third, it described the whole church, which lives under the shadow of the Most High while walking through history. Justin Martyr, in the 2nd century, argued that Jesus quoted this psalm in the wilderness precisely because he knew the psalm spoke of him, not as an amulet, as Satan proposed, but as a description of his own messianic path. Augustine, in the 4th century, read the psalm as the song of the pilgrim church, still crossing the valley of night fear, but already with the promise of the high stronghold guaranteed at the end. This triple reading of the believer, of Christ, of the church, shows how the psalm opened multiple doors for those who lingered over it carefully. And there is a textual observation that usually goes unnoticed in English, but is central in Hebrew. The psalm uses 4 different names for God in the first 2 verses. Look at the sequence. In verse 1, 2 names appear, Most High and Almighty. In Hebrew, Elyon and Shaddai. In the same verse, in the same sentence, in verse 2, two others appear, Lord and God. In Hebrew, YHWH and Elohim. Four different names in the first two verses. And this is not decorative poetic variety. Why does the psalmist concentrate four names like this at the beginning? Because each name carries a specific aspect. Elyon is God Most High, above all things, sovereign over the heavens. Shaddai is the God who is sufficient, the all-sufficient one, the one who sustains. YHWH is the covenant God, the one who revealed himself to Moses at the bush, the one who said, I am who I am, in Exodus 3:14. Elohim is the creator God, the mighty one. The psalm opens by concentrating the four names, as if to say the shelter where you take refuge is not just any shelter. It is the shelter of the sovereign, the sufficient one, the covenant faithful one, the creator. All in one sentence. And this abundance of names is not repetition, it is density. The psalm wants to show that the place the believer entered is the most protected place in the universe. Not because the believer is powerful, because the one who covers the shelter is powerful. And when we bring together everything that has come so far, one observation begins to stitch the whole psalm together. This psalm is not first a song about protection. It is first a song about who God is. Protection is the consequence. It is not the cause. Protection follows confession. Confession follows the knowledge of the name. The knowledge of the name is what makes the believer enter the shelter. The one who enters is the one who recognizes. The one who recognizes is the one who clings. And the clinging, the shashak, is what moves the voice of God to speak in verse 14. To invert that order is to fall into the trap Satan proposed in the wilderness. It is to take the protection and detach it from the knowledge. It is to want the shadow without recognizing the Most High. And the one who does that, even while quoting the psalm perfectly, is outside the psalm. Because the psalm does not work by verse magic, it works by the chain of the covenant. Shelter, confession, attachment, knowledge, protection, in that order. Remove one piece from the chain, and the chain falls. And there is another Hebrew word in verse 1 worth visiting before we finish. The word is tsel, translated as shadow. In the shadow of the Almighty he will abide. Tsel is not only shade as absence of sun. Tsel is shelter. It is the place of rest in the middle of desert heat. In the ancient Near East, to live under someone's shadow was a technical expression for being under that person's covenant protection. When Judges 9:15 speaks of men taking refuge in the shadow of the bramble, it is using this image of covenant protection. And when Psalm 91 says, the believer abides in the shadow of Shaddai, it is affirming exactly that. The believer is under covenant. He is inside the relationship. He is covered by the same figure that covered Moses in the cleft. And this shadow is not a generic poetic metaphor. It is technical language from the ancient world, saying, this one is mine. And here comes the time to stitch everything together. This psalm, read carefully, stops being a song of magical protection and becomes a manual of covenant. The three voices show that covenant is not solitary. There is the believer who confesses, there is the teacher who applies, there is God who confirms. The four names show that covenant is not with an impersonal force. It is with the sovereign, with the sufficient one, with the faithful one, with the Creator. The words for dwelling, living, and resting in the shadow show that covenant is not an occasional commitment. It is residence, it is address, it is continuity. The verses about protection show that covenant does not cover the one who jumps from a pinnacle to impress others. It covers the one who walks in the ways. And the ending with, I will show him my salvation, shows that covenant ends not in a material prize, but in vision. What kind of vision? Vision with the eyes. The believer will see with his own eyes the salvation. He will arrive at the Misgav with days satisfied. And perhaps the most important observation of all after this journey is this. Psalm 91 has been quoted by people who understood the text and by people who did not. It has been prayed at the bedside of the sick. It has been used on battlefields. It has been written on amulets. It has been remembered in moments of mourning. And it was distorted in the wilderness to tempt Jesus. The history of this psalm's interpretation is the history of a humanity that wanted the protection and at times did not want the way. Wanted the shadow of Shaddai, and at times did not want the covenant with YHWH, wanted the angels of verse 11, and at times forgot the phrase in the middle, to guard you in all your ways. The phrase that defines where the protection operates. The phrase, Satan cut to tempt Jesus. The phrase, much preaching still cuts, turning the psalm into a loose promise of guaranteed comfort. And the psalm, read whole, with the three voices in their places, refuses that amputation. It promises protection, yes. It promises deliverance, yes. But it promises within the shelter, within recognition, within attachment. And there is one last thing worth noticing about the way the psalm ends. Verse 16 says, I will show him my salvation. Salvation in Hebrew is Yeshua, and this word is at the root of the name Yeshua, the Hebrew name of Jesus. I am not forcing an etymological coincidence. I am simply showing that the psalm ends by pointing to a reality the believer will see, a salvation shown, displayed, revealed. The first Christian readers looked at this ending and said, this psalm ends by pointing to Christ. He is salvation made manifest. He is the Yeshua that is shown, and the wilderness scene closes the circle. Jesus, present in the psalm from the beginning, refuses the amputated reading, and by his own posture he confirms that the psalm is his. That he is the one who trod upon the lion and the serpent, that he is the one who dwells in the shelter of the Most High in a unique way, and that he offers the same shelter to those who cling to him. And when we reach the end of this psalm, after walking through the 16 verses, after hearing the three voices, after noticing the Hebrew words, after visiting the wilderness scene, one impression is hard to escape. This text is smaller than it seems and greater than it seems at the same time. Smaller because it is not the magical amulet many people want to make of it. It is not an automatic formula of protection against every danger. Greater because it is the invitation into a place that can hold anyone who decides to enter. The shelter of the Most High remains open. The shadow of Shaddai remains available. The Misgav remains standing. The three voices continue speaking in the same psalm every time someone enters the text with attention. There is the believer who confesses, there is the teacher who applies, there is God who confirms. And the one who reaches the end of the psalm, after crossing through the three voices, is invited to enter that chain, to confess with the first voice, to hear the second, to wait for the third. This is the psalm we have just studied, and this is why, for almost 3,000 years, it has remained the song many people repeat when night comes and the soul needs shelter. If this video opened a new way for you to read Psalm 91, share it with someone who would also like to see these three voices. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. I will see you in the next video.